So we're in the home stretch of the previews. I think today is actually going to be the final batch. So let's take a look and get started here. This is 10th District Hero for 1 and a white, 2/3 human with Collect Evidence 2. You pay 1 and a white to go with that Collect Evidence. You can turn it into a detective with base power toughness 4/4 and gaining vigilance. And then you can pay 2 and a white and collect 4 more evidence. If it was a detective, it becomes legendary creature Mileva the Stalwart. It has a base power of 5/5, and it gains other creatures you control have indestructible. Mileva has been mentioned in flavor text on a lot of cards throughout the other Ravnica sets, and this is the first time she kind of technically gets a legendary creature. So there's going to be people that are going to want to rule 0 this as their commander. My only disappointment in that is this is not red-white, so it does not have the Boros colorations to get that red part of their guild into the deck, even if you do that. But otherwise, this is a solid card. Collect Evidence, I think, with these smaller amounts, is pretty decent, and you're going to be able to run this in several kinds of decks. And this might even see play in constructed formats. I'm not sure, but this could see like a 2 of or whatever in those kind of decks. Then we have a card that is right at home in a Zedru the Great-Hearted deck. This is Coveted Falcon for 1 blue. It's a 1/4 bird with flying that when it attacks, gain control of target permanent you don't control, but you own. And then you can pay 1 and a blue. It's a disguise card to flip it over. And then when it is turned face up, target opponent gains control of any number of target permanents you control. Draw a card for each one they gained control this way. So like what I was saying, in a Zedru deck, you want to be giving them things anyway. So if you disguise this face down and then flip it up for its 2 cost and then give them a bunch of stuff in a big burst, you're going to get a bunch of life and cards off of Zedru's trigger. And then as this thing starts pecking away, you can reclaim some of those things back if you need them. Like if you need a land or something, you can just hit that person that has one of your lands, get the land back, and then you have access to it once again. Or maybe you want to take something back, so then you can use Zedru to give it back to them later in the game. There's a bunch of different things you could do here in that particular deck. Outside of that, I don't know where else this would actually see any kind of play, but in that deck, I could very much see it. Then if you've been reading the story, we have a story spotlight card, World Soul's Rage. For X green and a red, you get a sorcery that says it deals X damage to any target and put up to X land cards from your hand and or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. So you can burn somebody and ramp in, a pretty good burst. The cool part here is you're able to, if you mill stuff into your graveyard, you've been discarding, if you've been sacrificing your lands, like the Riveteer's Outlook type lands from New Capenna or fetch lands or any of that kind of stuff that goes into your graveyard to do things, you can use this to get them back later on in the game. And you don't have to delve a bunch of mana into this in the first place. You can just be like, okay, I'll put 3 mana into it and bring 3 lands back and lightning bolt somebody essentially. So there's a lot of function here. And if you're gonna like finish somebody off, or you just want to, get a bunch of stuff back that you've been milling into the yard, you can do a big blast of mana in this, burn somebody really heavily, or just burn away a big creature and still get the result you want of getting your lands back. And then somebody pointed out this is really funny with the Spelunking card on the Lost Caverns of Exelon set, because those lands then don't come in tapped, they come back untapped. Then we have what has been known as the weird destroy all artifacts thing that red gets in almost every set as of late. We have Anzarag's Rampage for 3 red. It's a sorcery. Destroy all artifacts you don't control. And then exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts that were put into graveyards from the battlefield this turn. You may put a creature card exiled this way onto the battlefield. It gains haste. Return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. So this kind of merges almost like a Vandal Blast, which costs 5 if you overload a Vandal Blast to destroy all of your opponent's artifacts. And then you get a tacked on ability of exiling the X cards for the number of artifacts that went away. And then you get a creature out of it. And then it also merges a little bit of Ilharg the Razebor's ability, where the creature comes in, it gains haste, and then it bounces back to your hand at the end of the turn. So it's kind of cool that it's a semi-tutoring effect, but you have to be careful because you can't count on treasures or anything that's sacrificable by your opponent, because if your opponent's paying attention, they're going to sacrifice that stuff in response, so you don't get as many exiles off the top to dig into your deck and get that big bad creature out. So you have to only count really the static stuff that's going to explode on your opponent's side of the board. And here we have a card that makes perfect sense, since Ward is featured heavily in the deck with the disguised creatures. This is Slice from the Shadows. It's an X and black. This spell can't be countered. Target creature gets -X until end of turn. So the more you pay into it, the bigger thing you can tear down or like finish something off after combat or whatever you want to do there. The interesting thing here, though, is the can't be countered clause. Remember, ward creatures can still be targeted with a spell. Then it gets countered if you don't pay the ward cost, but this spell can't be countered. So you don't have to pay the ward cost. Don't get fooled into paying a ward cost that you don't have to pay when playing a removal spell that says it cannot be countered. Then we have a card that is kind of interesting to me. You have to be careful when you play it, and you have to have a very heavy blue commitment. So I wouldn't play this in anything more than maybe a 2-color deck, and that's Reenact the Crime. For 1 triple blue, it's an instant that says exile target non-land card in a graveyard that was put there from anywhere this turn. Copy it. You can cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So if you make them discard it, mill it off their deck, they cast it themselves like an instant or sorcery, they went into the yard, you blow up stuff, whatever way you're getting those cards into the graveyard, then you get to basically make a copy of it and get rid of it from their graveyard for the rest of the game. So ideally you play this with like black or red or something. So say you use murder on something and get rid of their big like 12/12 dinosaur or whatever. Then you can cast Reenact the Crime, get rid of the thing so it's not coming back the rest of the game on their side of the board, and then you get a copy of it instead. Then we have another story spotlight in Audience with Trostani. For 2 and a green, you get a sorcery, create a 0/1 plant creature token, then draw cards equal to the number of differently named creature tokens you control. So this doesn't like want you to play a single type of creature token generation in your deck. It wants you to play multiple different kinds of tokens in your deck. One commander that I could see this seeing a lot of play with is Volo, because he actually likes it creates copies of creatures you have, and you have different names and different types with that guy. So you could get a lot of cards off of this within a deck like that where you're casting it. And then on top of that, it guarantees you at least 1 card off of it if you're in a pinch, because you're going to get that 0/1 green plant token. But if you're playing, elves and soldiers and humans and like all kinds of different stuff, you can get a big grip full of cards off of this with a little bit of balancing to get it to happen. Here we have another enchantment that helps us in red to kind of, get card draw sort of off of our deck in Expedited Inheritance. For red, it's an enchantment that says whenever a creature is dealt damage, its controller may exile that many cards from the top of their library, and they may play those cards until the end of their next turn. So if you're blocking or you're just running your creatures headlong into your opponent's stuff and they get blocked and die, you have the ability to exile the top of your stuff equal to the damage dealt. And then you can cast those if you have anything going on in the second main phase that you can cast, or up until the end of your next turn. Now, the bad part here is this also affects your opponents. They can do the same thing. That's why it's pretty cheap for the casting cost. So we're going to have to see if this is worth the risk of them gaining access to the exile ability as well. Depending on the deck you're coming up against, you could say this is pretty good, especially if someone's playing control, because they don't want to burn their spells right away and they don't want to have to sit on those things. So it's like, it's kind of cool. I like it. And it's like, okay, they've probably exiled counter magic or whatever. So you don't even have to worry about it. If they let stuff go out there, let it go. Don't cast into it. Just let it get exiled and be gone the rest of the game. And that they just lose their advantage there. Then we have the Simic and Dimir dual card, Flotsam and Jetsam. For 1 and a Simic color, you mill 3 cards and investigate. Pretty straightforward, kind of nice if you want something for a mill deck. And then Jetsam for 4 and 2 Dimir, you get each opponent mills 3 cards. Then you may cast a spell from each opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If a spell cast us, so we would put into a graveyard, exile it instead. So you can, pick something from each of your opponent's graveyards by just paying 6 and then cast it out. And if it's an instant or sorcery, it'll go away. If it's a permanent, you get it. I mean, there's nothing, stopping you from stealing their stuff that way. Pretty good card, but just remember, some playgroups don't appreciate you stealing their stuff. And this probably won't work great over Spell Table all that great either. So we'll see how well this works in Commander, but I think I would give it a try, especially if I have a mill deck that I'm messing around with. Next up is Krenko's Buzz Crutcher. So for 2 red, you got a 4/4 Insect Thopter with flying and trample. So pretty good stats on this thing. And when it enters the battlefield, for each player, destroy up to one non-basic land that player controls. For each land destroyed this way, its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the field tapped, then shuffle. So if you have a problematic land such as Field of the Dead or even Lotus Field, this can get rid of it. Now you might say, well, Lotus Field has hexproof. This doesn't target. It just says for each player, destroy up to one. There's no target land attached to this thing. So anything that has shroud or hexproof or whatever, doesn't matter. It's gone. You can blow it up and get it out of the way. So this card will probably see some kind of play, and it is really good in decks where you have problematic lands that your opponents are kind of driving you nuts with, the Maze of Iths of the world, the old Ixalan flip lands, even the new lands where the gods, the O'Hares, flip into the lands, and then before they can bring them back, slam down Krenko's Buzz Crusher and get rid of them for good. Now, Soul of Innervation here actually has a kind of a cool thing with it that I really like. For 3 and a black, you get an enchantment that has instant speed, so it's an instant speed removal spell. It gives a target creature -4/-4. On top of that, whenever one or more creatures leave your graveyard, each opponent loses life, you gain a life. And that means you can exile those things, so like the collect evidence ability, or you can start just slowly wheedling stuff out of your yard or returning them to your hand to cast back out. There's all kinds of things you can do. But I like this because it has kind of a sort of ability partially of Sir Conrad when things enter or leave your graveyard. Well, in this case, instead of the enters part, it's leaving. So this card kind of interests me. I want to see what we can do with this in a deck that's all about cards bouncing in and out of your graveyard. Then we have a translated card here. This is Improbable Explosion for 2, a blue, and a red. You get a sorcery, draw 2 cards, then you may discard 2 cards. When you do, Improbable Explosion deals X damage to each creature where X is the highest mana value among the discarded cards. So if you need like a board wipe of some sort, you can pitch some of your stuff out into the graveyard. Now, depending on how much of a board wipe you need, you can kind of control where things are going. So say your opponent's playing a bunch of little low toughness stuff, so pitch a 2 or 3 drop into the graveyard and have that be the high end. And then maybe your stuff has 5 power or 5 toughness. It actually allows you to keep your stuff and get rid of their stuff versus, Blasphemous Act doing 13 to everything or Burn Down the House doing 5 damage to everything. You may not want the 5 damage. You may want a lower amount. Or inversely, you may need that bigger amount. So you might need to dump, a 10 drop instant or sorcery in the graveyard in order to just wipe out the battlefield. So whatever you need, this has a little bit of tailoring available to it. I kind of like that. Then we have Dockside Extortionist's Worst Enemy. Here is Vengeful Tracker. For 1 and a red, you get a 2/2 human detective. When an opponent sacrifices an artifact, Vengeful Tracker deals 2 damage to them. So if you have this down and they slam that Dockside Extortionist, they're going to take 2 damage for every treasure they use off of that Extortionist. This is really strong. Like food tokens, clue tokens, any of those little dumb artifact tokens that they sacrifice, this thing's going to shock them every single time. And this is really powerful. And on top of that, it's an uncommon, so it's going to be really easy to get your hands on. Here we have probably the most powerful of the collect evidence cards that I've seen so far. Incinerator of the Guilty. It's a 4 and 2 red 6/6 dragon with flying and trample that when it deals combat damage to a player, you can collect evidence X. When you do, it deals that much damage to each creature and planeswalker that player controls. So, if they can't stop this thing from hitting, they're likely going to lose their board on that one hit. And then you can go around the board each combat. And if your opponents don't deal with this, one at a time, they're going to lose all of their creatures and planeswalkers. This thing is really powerful. I like this card a lot. If you're a fan of Gonti, then this card is for you. This is Outrageous Robbery. For X black. It's an instant. Target opponent exiles the top X cards of their library face down. You may look at and play those cards for as long as they remain exiled. If you cast a spell this way, you may spend mana as though it were any color or type to cast it. So this way, you're able to go ahead and cast multiple cards, because Gonti, you either have to recast him over and over, resurrect him, or flicker him, or whatever to get multiple cards off of him. This one, you're just like, okay, I like your deck. I'll mill you for, 8 or whatever. exile those cards, and then be like, all right, I got access to 8 of your cards. And if you have a way to get instants and sorceries back out of your graveyard, you can get this back and do it over and over again. I mean, regardless, this is also a good way for you to be able to exile somebody's deck. Like if you know they have something on top because they've scryed something on top, or they use one of the tutors that put cards back on top of their library or whatever, you can slam this and steal whatever they just tutored for, and then they don't get it back. Even if you never cast these things, you get to exile them and get them out of the game for the rest of the game. So this is pretty strong, and I really like this card. Now, this one I couldn't find a translated variation of, but this is Yaris Roar of the Gods for 2 red-green. You have a Centaur Druid. Other creatures you control have haste, which I like that one. And then whenever one or more face-down creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So morphs, megamorphs, cloaked cards, manifest cards, disguised creatures, all this stuff can draw you cards when they do combat damage. And then whenever a face-down creature you control dies, return it to the battlefield face down under its owner's control if it's a permanent, and then flip it face up. So if they die and you put it back onto the battlefield, if it was an instant or a sorcery, like any of those kind of things, they won't flip up. You'll just get them back as a 2/2 face down. But if they were actual permanents, enchantments, artifacts, and creatures, planeswalkers, whatever, that got cloaked or manifested down, you get them flipped face up without paying their cost if they die in combat. So you can just, with impunity, just swing over and over again with these creatures and get them back, especially if they were things that can't be flipped up anyways. So this way you have basically a steady supply of 2/2s to be able to punch at your opponents. So yeah, I kind of dig this guy. I think I want to try to build around this and see what kind of deck we can pull together, looking back at the history of things that we can do with face-down creatures. Now, this one I could not find a regular printing of that was translated, but they did have the dossier version that translated. I do not like this frame treatment because you can't tell the color of them on site without staring at their casting cost. But this is Wisp Drinker Vampire for 2, a white and a black. You get a Vampire Rogue 2/4 flyer that says whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses a life and you gain 1 life. So that's really, really strong, because then you have things that create 1/1 tokens in big bursts, or we're in white, so you have ways of copying those things. Spirit tokens, soldier tokens, you name it. These things can all trigger this thing going off multiple times, and there's no restriction on how many times it actually triggers. Then it also has an ability of 5 white, black. Creatures you control with power 2 or less gain death touch and lifelink until end of turn. So there's a big thing going on here. And also being in black and white, we also have the afterlife mechanic available to us from the last Ravnica sets. So we have the ability for when those afterlife spirits come in, this will trigger, and then you can grant those things death touch and lifelink as we go along deeper into the game. So this card actually is really strong. I'm trying to think. What's his name? Edgar Markov. there it is. The Eminence ability, the vampires that come off of it, this would fit perfectly in that deck, because every time you create an Eminenced vampire token, this was going to trigger. So that's really, really strong. Sticking in the theme of power 2 or less, we have Snarling Gorehound. For a black, it's a 1/1 menacing dog that whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, surveil 1. So this allows us to do, card quality control and fill our graveyard up and do all kinds of stuff. So again, I keep saying this a lot lately, the Myco Tyrant or Sidisi, this card would be really, really freaking good in those decks, because every time you make a zombie off of Sidisi, this would trigger, and then you get to surveil something off the top of the deck, and it could actually start chaining zombies off of Sidisi. With the Myco Tyrant, every time the end trigger goes off and you get all those fungus tokens, it's going to trigger for each one of the fungus tokens coming into the battlefield, and you're going to get to, kick some more stuff off the top of your deck, or to just look at stuff that's going on. So this has some stuff. I actually like this better with the Sidisi card, because you get to do that during your turn, whereas Myco Tyrant is at the end of the turn, and you're not going to get a second bite at getting the permanents going into the graveyard, but still, this is very strong, and I like this card. Do you like clues? Then this is the card you're going to want to play if you do. This is Officious Interrogation for a white and a blue. It costs white, blue more to cast for each target beyond the first, so essentially Strive. Choose any number of target players, investigate X times, where X is the total number of creatures those players control. So, as I was saying, if you like clues, you really want to play this card, because if you have 3 opponents in your game and a full pod, you can pay 6 mana, 3 white, 3 blue, and gain clue tokens, however many creatures they might have on the board. So if each player has, an average of 5 creatures apiece or whatever, you're going to get 15 clue tokens out of nowhere off of this thing. That's pretty strong, especially if you're playing any kind of artifact synergies or things that allow you to drain stuff out. An Esper build could use that new Gorgon that gives poison counters when you sacrifice clue tokens. There's a lot of possibility here. I really like this one too. Then we have a card adding another new counter to the game. This is Illicit Masquerade for 3 and a black. You get an enchantment with flash that says when it enters the battlefield, put a counterfeit counter on each of your creatures. Then if a creature you control with a counterfeit counter on it dies, exile it and return up to one other target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you can put, these on all your stuff, and then say somebody board wipes you, well, you'll just exile all your stuff, and anything that's in your graveyard, it's immediately coming onto the board. Or you can kind of set it up where you're going to flash this in at the end of somebody else's turn with the intention to do a board wipe yourself, getting rid of all their blockers, getting all your stuff back, and then going ahead and just swinging out, especially if you have the ability to give them haste in like a black-red or a Jund build or something of that nature. Now I have some bad news. There was a lot of expectation when the story finally finished at the beginning of last week that there was going to be a second version of Teysa Karlov as a ghost, and maybe even as a mythic, because we have never had a mythic Teysa before. But unfortunately, the art they showed is for this card, Call a Surprise Witness. For 1 and a white sorcery, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield, put a flying counter on it, and it's a spirit in addition to its other types. So in flavor here, you can actually bring back the new Teysa along with her other variation, her original, the Orzhov Scion, with this card. So you are technically bringing her back from the dead as a ghost. It's not another new card. Then we have Insidious Roots. This card is pretty cool. For black-green, you get an enchantment. Creature tokens you control tap to add 1 mana of any color. And whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 green plant creature token and put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. So if you have a way to slowly bleed cards out of your graveyard, whether it's small amounts of collect evidence or ways of bringing them back or whatever, you have the ability to create these plant tokens and then make them big, like slowly over time. And including the fact that we're in green, we have the ways to make those counters actually go even further for us. There's a lot of things here that could be done with this card. I kind of want to see if I can come up with a way to get our stuff back with consistency and, keep bouncing and creating more and more of these plant tokens. And then the last 2 cards that I found were non-translated ones, but I found some translations off to the side here. We have Detective's Bag. For 2, a blue and a red, you get an artifact that says when it enters the battlefield, investigate twice. And then you can tap and create a 1/1 colorless Thopter token with flying. Activate only if you sacrificed an artifact this turn. So as you're sacrificing, again, clues, treasures, blah, 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 you can tap this and create a Thopter. And if you have a way to untap this, you can do it multiple times in a turn. So any kind of artifact deck, which is usually in the blue-red color combination anyways, this will probably be really good in that particular deck. Then the last card, I don't know how accurate this translation is. This is Goes Around, Comes Around. For a blue and a red, you get an instant on the one side. Target creature attacks or blocks this turn if able. So you can kind of force somebody's thing to attack if you need to get through, and they're just kind of sitting there trying to keep you from pounding them with stuff. And then comes around for 4 and then 2 of Gruul colors. Creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. You may turn a creature you control face up. So it seems like Gruul in this set is about flipping like big creatures up out of disguise. And then in this case, you kind of get a mini overrun effect on top of that. So you get to pump all your forces up and flip over something big and nasty at the same time. So this is kind of interesting. I like it. It's Teamer colors. Not very commonly used color set in Commander, but this has some interesting functions to it. But there are better overrun cards available. So unless you're planning on playing like Ravnica exclusive stuff, which I'm going to be doing some stuff with that later on here down the line, there are better cards out there to use than this. So that's what I have for you today. I do believe this is the end of the main set previews. Unless there's something major that comes on, I'm probably not going to cover any more previews for the main set. So with that said, though, I am going to be doing my Commander Precon videos starting here in the next day or two. I'm going to be actually pouring over those lists as soon as this video is edited and up so I can start making that video. And until then, I will catch you in the next one. I hope you keep an eye out for them.